Hey, my name is Nathan Brown, and today I'll be presenting about the murder of Grace Brown. It was a case that captivated the American public, and it inspired Theodore Dreiser's novel titled An American Tragedy. At first glance, it's like the tragic story of a young woman who was murdered by her boyfriend or husband. It was just like her lover named Chester Gillette, but the surface is like way deeper than that, um, and which is what I want to go over today. And I'll explore how like Grace Brown case became like a national obsession from that time, and it also reflected how the early 20th century anxieties and about gender and ambition really affected women and relationships. And then some argue that the trial of Chester delivered justice and served as a moral warning, but I'll argue that both the media and the public lean too heavily on personal morality and ignore the deeper social forces that happen. So I will go over class structure, gender, and the influence of the American dream. I'll also explore the novel that Theodore wrote, titled The American Tragedy. Okay, so the first thing I want to go over is gender. Grace Brown was a factory girl from like a rural background, given the time period this was from, the early 20th century. And she was framed by newspapers and like commentators as both a fallen woman and an innocent victim. And I want to explain what that means here in a bit. After her death, she wrote personal letters to Chester Gillette, and they were read out loud in court. And they were published in the newspaper and turned into emotional public artifacts. And they revealed her how vulnerable she was, and her desperation and depression, and pleading with Chester to marry her and save her from her disgrace due to her pregnancy. So it was pretty much a hard time that the couple was having, and at the time, early 20th century America held strict ideas about females, like when it comes to pregnancy. So women like Grace, who stepped outside these boundaries, were often harshly judged, and the public was both scandalized and captivated by her letters. But their response was moralistic because Grace became a cautionary tale, and her death seen as consequence of her behavior as much as Chester's. Some might even argue that this portrayal helped generate public sympathy and ensure Chester was convicted. However, I think that this narrative also reduced Grace to a stereotype, not as a full person with dreams and agency, but as a tragic figure meant to warn other women. The focus on her morality diverted attention from larger questions. For instance, like how society failed to protect the vulnerable woman from exploitation. Now, the second major theme I want to go over is class, and how Chester Gillette's ambition collided with social limitations. Chester came from a religious but struggling family, so we could say lower class. And though he worked at his uncle's factory, but really wasn't making that much, he aspired to move up in society, especially after meeting women from a higher social circles, like Harriet Benedict, who was another lover of his. Sorry about that. So especially, I think I met off with his other lover, Harriet Benedict. So in Grace, he saw both love and obligation, but in Harriet, he saw opportunity. To him, Grace was a part of a past he wanted to escape. He no longer want to live that poor life that he was living. And it tied to the working class and moral expectations. Killing her may have been a way, which is conscious or not, to erase that obligation so he can move up in life. And in the novel, An American Tragedy, explores this exact tension, because Clyde Griffiths, the fictional version of Chester, isn't portrayed as a simple villain. Instead, he frames him as a product of capitalism and social pressure, someone chasing the American dream at any cost, which is what we can hypothesize that Chester did. He's torn between desire and duty, love and ambition. He loves one woman, but wants to chase the ambition of another. The counter argument here is clear. Chester made his choices. He lied, manipulated, and ultimately murdered someone who loved him. Blaming the system might seem like excusing him. However, I believe Draser's point, and mine of course, is not to excuse him, but to show that choices don't happen in a vacuum. There are reasons for everything. And when upward mobility is everything, success is defined by wealth and status. People like Chester can be driven to be desperate, which can lead to unfortunate violence. And finally, I want to go over the role of media, because I feel like it's something that cannot be ignored. The murder and the trial of Chester was national sensations. Newspapers covered every detail, from Grace's suitcase and love letters to courtroom sketches of Chester's sketches of Chester's stoic expression. The public devoured the story, not just as a crime, but as a morality play. Grace was the tragic victim, Chester the cold, ambitious killer. Reporters turned the trial into entertainment, shaping public opinion before the jury was even able to make a decision. Today, we see similar patterns in high-profile cases, where the media narrative often outweighs the evidence, which plays a big part in lots of decisions. And this raises the question, did Chester get a fair trial, or was he convicted in part because the public needed a villain to complete the story? Now, I'm neither defending or excusing what he did, just pointing out the facts. Some argue that the media simply reported the facts and reflected society's outrage, but the selective way facts were presented, emphasizing Grace's purity, Chester's detachment, and the theoretical aspects, suggests a more complicated picture. The media didn't just report the story, they created it. Now, this spectacle ultimately served as both punishment and performance, reinforcing gender roles, moral codes, and class boundaries, while disguising the deeper problem underneath. So, in conclusion, this was a pretty crazy case, and the murder of Grace Brown and the trial of Chester offer much more than a tragic love story. They really expose the fault lines of the early 20th century America. Gender expectations, social class, which honestly I think gender expectation and social class work hand in hand. Males, especially males, were expected to be higher in the social class. They were seen as providers, when this can drive any man mad. Once again, not excusing what he did. And of course, the dangerous promise of the American dream, which is what the man chased. So you can see how all three topics work hand in hand. The case became a national obsession because it touched lots of cultural nerves, like sex, ambition, betrayal, and justice. And this is why it was on the corner of every street and every newspaper. And through Dreiser's and American Tragedy, we're reminded that behind every quote-unquote true crime is a deeper question about the world we live in. Why did he do it? Who gets to rise? What led to this type of stuff? Why is he getting judged? Who's getting judged? And who's going to get remembered at the end of the day? And while Chester was rightfully held accountable, which he should have been, because he did, it was a murder case, it's still way deeper than that. His crime, there are multiple layers to it, and the way his story was told, and the way Grace's story was told, was used, shows how it can show how easily justice can become spectacle, and how quickly personal tragedy becomes public entertainment. Thank you for watching.